My name is Inger Stark, and I am part of the Peralta Online Equity Initiative team. And I would like to welcome you all to day 2 of the Online Equity Conference. As you know, we designed the 3 days to be learn, analyze, and build. And so we are in the afternoon of day 2, which is analyze. I want to let you know that we are recording, and recordings will be available after the conference. I wanted to let you know that live captioning option is turned off. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a little place where you can either turn the captions on or off to see them yourselves. I also wanted to let you know that we do have to stop right at 45 minutes because we use the same Zoom room for the entire day conference meetings. And I hope you will engage in chat. I am very active in chat for the events that I attend, and I hope you will. And our presenters may or may not be chat watchers, but I will be there also. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Sara Bell and Leslie Hurt, who are our presenters for the hour or the 45 minutes. On your mark, get set, go.
All right, thanks. Can you see the screen now, the green screen?
Yes, we can, I think.
Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna move my camera so that, let's see, it's going very well. All right, well, my name is Sara Bell, and I'm a humanities instructor at Vance-Granville Community College in Henderson, North Carolina. We have 4 counties in North Carolina, so Henderson is where our original campus is. And go ahead, Leslie.
Okay, and my name is Leslie Hurt. I'm an instructor of sociology. I'm also here at Vance-Granville Community College. As Sara said, we have 4 campuses, so we're right outside of the Raleigh-Durham area. So it's very busy on the southern end and our southern campus, but we also have a very rural campus. So it's kind of a challenge having the population served that we do, serving the 4 campus radius. Yeah, sociologists. Yeah. So some of the stuff that we're talking about today, as a sociologist, you're going to know for sure, but other disciplines, we're going to be able to relate to this as well. So utilizing discipline-specific methods to design equity-focused classroom activities. Okay, Sara, go to the next slide, please. So if you look here, the objectives for this is focus on the role of storytelling. In sociology, I came into sociology and I was basically, once I found sociology, I was a conflict theorist, right? So I thought everything was about power. Everything was about power. But I realized this is as an African-American male, and from my perspective and where I fit on the social location, it seemed like it was, right? But when I start looking at equity, I start realizing that, hey, man, I might really need to look at maybe a symbolic interactionist perspective. And that's the idea of listening to, everybody has different views, different perspectives, different life experiences. So to understand different people, you got to learn to put yourself in their shoes. So we came to this idea of storytelling. You have to be able to hear someone else's point of view, someone else's story to kind of understand, you know, what's going on. So the objectives also share class activities we found effective in promoting active listening, engagement, and understanding. Reflect on those challenges, because in this day and time, there are challenges, especially in education. There are distinct challenges to implementing equity. Learn from you. We want to hear from some suggestions you might have, some things that you might try in your classrooms and for your different disciplines. Me and Sara, we always talk. We're on diversity council together. We always exchange ideas. But she's in humanities, I'm in social sciences, so a lot of that is very similar. But we do have some different things that we've talked to other faculty members about, some different approaches, and we want to hear some of the stuff that you might try in your classes. Next slide, Sara.
So if you all would, just while we're talking, if you would introduce yourselves in the chat, especially including your discipline, because as Leslie said, you know, our idea for this talk really kind of was fomented when the Dean of Health Sciences on our campus, Dr. Angela Thomas, invited us to visit her class. She was inviting her students to really unpack biases as future healthcare professionals, and was utilizing some really interesting approaches and tools. And we realized our disciplines are very centered in storytelling, and we oh, sorry, Leslie, was this your slide, wasn't it? I think I
No, you can
jumped the gun. But yeah, but we were inspired by the possibilities of how our disciplines that are so focused in the process of storytelling, it's kind of part of our methodology, but that is possible to find the story in whatever discipline that you practice, especially STEM disciplines and areas where it might not be as, equity might not be as obvious. It's not a part of the conversation necessarily, but equitizing courses is just as, of course, essential. So go ahead, Leslie.
As Sara was saying before, when we went to this, and I always think about equity like this. I've heard so much about equity. I actually did a presentation on equity in 2015, and no one was talking about equity. No one said anything about equity at all. But now equity has become this big catchphrase, like all over the country. Everybody has a DEIB council. Everybody has equity. But I was always curious about, do we really practice what we preach? Do we really have just councils, or are we really practicing these things? So if we look here, we went to this class, and it was the most amazing thing you wouldn't think about in a radiography class, that you would see this, but we didn't know what to expect. She wanted us to come and be judges. We sat in this class, and there were all these different poster boards on the walls. And they had all this stuff about every kind of stereotype you could think of, from racial, gender, sexual orientation, everything you could think of. And she wanted the class, think about a radiography class, she wanted the class to come in and just put whatever stereotype you've heard about any one of these racial, ethnic groups, things like that. To have that on the wall in a radiography classroom was unbelievable when you think about doing equity work, actually doing the work. We examined this, and she wanted them to come up with a project to address this idea of equity, because not only at school, but in the workforce, you might hear that. You might be giving someone an x-ray, and you may hear one of those terms. How are you going to react? If you may feel that way towards somebody who addresses you like that, are you going to give them care? I mean, this is like real life practical examples of equity. So when we look at this stuff in the classroom, and I saw that firsthand, think about the idea of being inclusive. You have to have an inclusive and trustworthy kind of environment. Okay, if people can't trust you, if they don't think it's authentic, they're not really going to engage in kind of equity work. Consider the space. Right now, this is a big idea, the space. How is your classroom configured? Is it online? Is it a virtual classroom? Is it hybrid? Is it face-to-face? We have a VNet classroom where we're broadcast in 4 different campuses at the same time. So you got to look at your space. How's it configured? Accommodations. I know several people here I saw in the chat, are at community colleges. We have an open door policy. So you have to really look at your population served. So equity is going to be a big thing. You have people in high school here. You have people 60 years old. You have people in rural, urban, all kinds of things that you may have to address, disabilities, that kind of stuff. Incorporate a variety of methods and tools. We try to do that all the time. Textbooks, videos, different kind of assessments, that kind of thing. Storytelling. We look at storytelling. This is what this is all about. You have to find the different people's stories, find their perspective. That helps in your equity work. You have to know where people are coming from, okay? Reflection, encourage your students to reflect on their own beliefs and values. One thing I found right now that is becoming challenging, but if you do it the right way, if you kind of set up the classroom in the beginning, it becomes easier at the end. Respect, listen and promote respectful dialogue. If you really listen to a student, they tend and have respect for them. I see they tend to really respect you. That opens up some kind of dialogue. Be flexible. Be flexible to these new approaches, right? And you got to be prepared. You always got to be prepared for some kind of backlash, because it may come. Okay, it may come. If you have this inappropriate or confrontation remarks, I do want to hear some of those ideas. How do we handle that? Because that does happen. That does happen. Not as often as if you set up the classroom properly in the beginning, but it doesn't matter. In this day and time, it will come. So this big push for equity is not really shared by everybody. So how do you deal with that when those confrontations come up? All right, next one. Sara, it's on you.
Okay, thanks. So I jumped the gun there a second ago, but so just to get back to this focus of storytelling and why I know there's a session on storytelling that it's either already happened and I couldn't attend, and I'm looking forward to watching the recording. But you know, some of us might recognize this already. I mean, I'm looking at all of our disciplines. We've got lots of course, English faculty here. My background is in folklore, you know, which is stories are the life breath and air that we breathe, of course. But they're human. Humans are designed to crave stories. I mean, you know, often in the folklore realm and culture studies, we talk about how, you know, stories are as important to us as air and water and food. But obviously, you know, they have been, or maybe not so obviously, we recognize how effective they are in teaching, and especially in teaching from the perspective of DEIB plus work. You know, because of course first and foremost, you know, we're entertained by stories. Students especially remember when you deliver content in the form of a story or find a way to connect. You know, the stories are reflective. We reflect our own experiences. We learn from the experiences of others. Stories both teach us a sense of, you know, a set of morality and traditional beliefs and values, but they also challenge whatever traditional beliefs and values that we've been taught. Invite us to reconsider viewpoints, help us develop empathy. We are inspired by stories. Our imaginative and creative powers are sparked by them. And also, of course, there is the possibility for healing and catharsis. And I put an image here from our state because we have a really, like most of our states in our country and every place we come from in the world, a really vibrant Indigenous community, and especially in our service area. So in the northern part of our service area, we have a lot of students who are members of the Haliwa-Saponi tribe. And so, you know, especially from the folklore perspective, utilizing oral history is really powerful. And so the way, just kind of as an introduction, we're gonna try not to talk too much. But we do want to share because, of course, as Leslie said, in sociology, in humanities, and social sciences in general, you know, it's just a matter of course that we are able to utilize stories. And many of your disciplines also are, you know, I'm thinking of the law, I'm thinking of, you know, of course, other arts disciplines. I think somebody said they're a photographer, but the methodologies and practices that we are aware of, which are also helpful teaching tools to help us teach students more about our disciplines and more about, and to deliver content, are also, you know, we can leverage those in ways that can find the story. And I've just got a really quick, an image here and a quick reference if anybody wants to explore it more, if you're not already familiar with this really wonderful series. It was a PBS series called Design E Squared, and I think it's got multiple seasons. But one episode that I love is focusing on an architect named Sergio Palaroni, who's teaching architecture from a social justice lens. And, you know, architecture is a very creative field. It's also very technical, but he is also, his students are going out into communities, inviting the community members to share their stories, and then they're designing around the stories that they hear. So designing functional spaces that are also taking into consideration, you know, communities' culture, communities' experiences, the needs of a community, rather than, for example, when, you know, a government will put up maybe affordable housing for a community without really engaging the community in the process. So that's kind of one example of how kind of what we're thinking of here, and how we also, and to all of you, so we're going to have a discussion set toward the end, and but be thinking maybe as we're talking about ways that you are challenged to figure out how to make your assignments in your classes more equitable. And also if you've been able to utilize tools that we can learn, because we also really want to focus on how we can collaborate with one another across disciplines to develop new ideas. Leslie, you're muted. I don't know if you know.
Okay. In social sciences, the one way that we do to look at equity is, first off, in some classes, especially a social diversity class, social problems class, this kind of thing, I use some things. One thing I use is the Harvard implicit bias test. Now, I know it has some problems, some issues, but it's always a good start to realize that everybody kind of has biases. Once again, I always say that I use the more of a symbolic interactionist viewpoint now versus the conflict, because I realize that I do have these biases, right? I have these biases, but I do want to hear from other people's perspective because their life situations, you know, it's not necessarily like mine. So I always go in first and establish rapport. I tell my story first. I want my students to know that I'm human. Hey, I have biases. I do have biases, right? I have things that I prefer. Now, I always try to be, value free and keep my biases out of the equation. So, my perception is not skewed and that kind of thing. But I want them to know I have biases, right? I'm a relatable person. I'm not just I'm just not a teacher up here and you're way down here. I want it to be relatable. I want them to know that they can trust me, rapport, you can say whatever. It's a open classroom. You can say what you want, right? Also try to do some interactive exercises so they can actually relate and have some empathy for each other. Now, one that I do, it's called Spend, right? And it looks at a single mother in Durham, North Carolina, and it's an interactive exercise that you can do. And if you all want it, I could send it out to you all. But what it does is saying you have, $1,000, $1,500, and you have to make it for a month. You're dependent on family, friends, whatever you have to do. You're working a job, but you need daycare, your car breaks down. Can you make it to the end of the month if you start off with $1,500, right? And I have all the students play this game. They do this interactive game, and then they talk. They start talking to each other. But that way, they're starting to build some kind of understanding and some kind of empathy towards each other. So then once you get that empathy for each other, right, you can relate to your instructor, well, then equity actually becomes possible. Because right now, in today's time, sometimes it's hard to have that tough, equitable conversation. It is. It's hard to have a conversation about equity because everybody doesn't feel that way. But if you can have students at least feel some empathy towards each other and some connection to you, then it's actually, it becomes possible, right? So then we can go out and look at some quantitative data versus qualitative data. Traditionally, and if you're a scientist on here, quantitative data is kind of that's the standard, what everybody lives by, but I've been getting more into qualitative data, right? I see some sociologists on here, and the sociological imagination always asking the question, why? There's always a reason why we do the things that we do. You might not want to say it, but there's always a reason why. So I start looking more at qualitative data, right? Looking at those stories, getting people to talk, ask open-ended questions, getting them to talk about their experiences, okay? So, and finally, to look at real equity, you have some multimodal cultural assignments, okay? Let the students tell their own stories, whether that's through videos, whether that's through art, whether that's oral history, maybe that might be an essay. Traditionally, as social scientists, we've depended on essays all the time. But I know me and Sara had went to a conference before on equity, and that was one of the big things I took out of that was the multimodal assignments, right? If you believe that a student that can't write very well, and especially in a community college, if you believe their writing skills are not that, they're not that good, so they're not intelligent, that is not true. That's not true at all. Sometimes they may have come in from a different environment. Sometimes something has happened, but they may know the knowledge. but you may have to go through a different means to get that. So that's some things that we try here. Now, Sarah, you can go to the next one for yours. And I want you all to think about some of the stuff you may do in your discipline.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. And I love that you talked about the multimodal assignments, because I found so much success with that. And so all of these, everything that we're talking about, that's another way to kind of integrate whatever your disciplinary strengths are, but give different diverse ways to present information. And also you mentioned telling your story. So, I teach humanities. Humanities, of course, is the study of being human, right? So I've begun to start every class with an identity chart, and just inviting students, because this is, first of all, a way for students to kind of, first of all, tell their story. I tell mine too, I share mine. And then we recognize what, it's a really challenging prospect for a lot of students. You start to recognize that the concept of identity, which is so central to cultural studies, is not something that most of us really are invited to think about, being reflective about who we are. And so in this process, I also have to say that I just attended the e-portfolio session, which was completely illuminating to me. I had no idea about e-portfolios, and I'm super excited about the idea of incorporating them with this kind of project, and maybe making it a class, a project that continues to incorporate the work that we do throughout the class, because it's a place for, first of all, the question to ask is, how do you know? I always use the lunchroom. Like, if you're walking to the lunchroom in high school or junior high, which table would you feel okay sitting at? Which table would you feel really weird and not like you don't belong? So just being able to just jumpstart that conversation about belonging and otherness. Where do you belong? Where don't you belong? And then the possibility of recognizing the intersectionality, where you do connect. So that's always a starting point. And I think that it doesn't have to be just in humanities courses. I mean, it's super beneficial when you're going to be exploring all kinds of aspects of diverse cultures and experience, but it's one way to do it. As a folklorist, oral history and ethnography is a really central part of the work that we do. So collecting people's stories. And this is another way, this also doesn't necessarily have to be the realm only of cultural studies. I mean, oral histories can be conducted among, students of law enforcement, could interview people, different members of the criminal justice community in your area. Recognize that everybody's different perspective. I mean, ways that oral histories are beneficial is that you see how lived experience, even individual lived experience, can help to illuminate the larger aspects of historical, cultural, political circumstances. And then, collecting multiple histories gives you a broader picture, but also gives you the recognition that, people are not their broader stereotypical group of belonging, right? So everybody's individual experience is unique and special. It's also a fantastic active learning activity, and it can be longitudinal, so it can be something that sort of carries through an entire course, that can be revisited and continued throughout an entire class period to sort of touch on different topics that you're covering throughout a course. And also, another option, another possibility for students to reflect on their own experience and broaden their understanding of diverse experiences. And of course, like all of these assignments, can also promote critical thinking skills. A couple of other kind of possible really specific assignments that I love. I love historiography assignments, especially from a history perspective. Historians, of course, know that historiography is the study of history, how we look at the way that history has been told through time, and utilize different perspectives to try to understand the process of making history. And so, one of the most fascinating projects, especially for example, in a Southern culture class, is looking at textbooks. So, being able to look at textbooks that were published during the Jim Crow era. I picked on one of our colleagues is here, who is from Alabama. I didn't mean to pick on his state, but all of us have, we are able to recognize that the cultural worldview is taught and it changes, right? So it's generational. So if you were brought up in the South at any point during, you know, the 20th century, you were probably taught a history that was incredibly skewed and biased. At various points, you know, sometimes in film studies, you can look at sort of the way the pictures of the South have been promoted. Stereotypes of Southerners have dramatically changed over the years, depending on, you know, a romantic notion of the South and Gone with the Wind, you know, the Birth of a Nation, the original Birth of a Nation, you know, demonizing Black people particularly for the project of white supremacy. And then Roots, you know, recentering the narrative, which is another really, really cool potential project that's really fun, especially from like in creative writing and English courses. The idea, and this can also be done in history, giving students the chance to imagine the perspective of whoever wasn't telling the story, right? So always recognizing the sort of power relationship and who gets to tell the story. And so I have a couple of examples here: Wicked and The Wind Done Gone. You know, people sort of looking at the story from different characters' perspectives. And this can apply across all disciplines and all genres. I mean, there are ways to also recognize, not necessarily if the content of your courses is not centered on storytelling exactly. You know, it's an opportunity to look at how the discipline has been, you know, dominated by, like, especially, you know, from a decolonization perspective, you know, how whoever has power in society, right, tells the story. And so, of course, because cultural studies is always, you know, who has power in society is always a theme that threads through it. It gives us the chance to look at power and empowerment and kind of re-look at the story. And just as a kind of a segue into inviting your discussions with you all, I just want to show an example of how this is the recentering of the narrative is still really current in really particular ways. And this is sort of from the journalism perspective, and especially in our society where journalists are really trained to be unbiased, and yet still bias is sometimes really, you know, almost impossible to eradicate. So there was a shooting at the University of Cincinnati by a University of Cincinnati campus police officer. And this was the image that NBC News chose to portray the news story. The police officer, who was not the victim, dressed in his uniform, and the victim from a police mugshot. Of course, this lit up the Twitter sphere, and so people were very quick to try to correct that. But this is an opportunity to really see how much our brains are programmed the way that we've been brought up. So okay, so that now I know we buzzed through that. I know I spoke really quickly, but we really do want to hear from you. We want to you know, hear your perspectives. Maybe if you have questions or are confused about how to approach these issues, or if you've been successful. And Leslie, I know I think I stepped on your slide here.
There's a question in the chat, whether you also have an example from STEM courses.
I guess the one example we would have, like we had said earlier, the one that I know of for sure was the one with radiography. I don't know of one. I guess this is why we wanted to address you all. If we do have a scientist there on the meeting, do we have one there on the meeting that is in the STEM field that would have a suggestion?
Sara, you're muted.
I was just reading the comment from Christina, because you grew up in the GDR, and you know, I have a lot of friends also. We were about college age when reunification happened, and it was, you know, it was such an interesting. I would love to hear your perspective on that, because that's that's you have a really unique perspective in that realm also.
Yeah, I was not college age at that time, but I think 5th or 6th grade when we had more conscious history lessons. And so needed to do research in the library and textbooks, and suddenly the language changed entirely. It felt like all the books that I had known were a bit more biased than the ones that came after. But I suspect if there was yet another change, I'd probably have a very similar feeling reading different books. And I've also seen that quite during other historical research during high school, that the books or text from the early 1900s was also very, very different in what people shared, how they shared it. And so every time that we live in is being shaped by the writing and by the opinions of people. And so nothing is really ever objective. And we do need to acknowledge that, I think, and see that there is subjectivity and a particular point of view in it, even though it might not be very explicit from the start.
Absolutely. I mean, that's making me think of in my discipline in folklore, in my graduate studies, one of the most powerful teaching tools was for us, and this also could be done in any discipline, going through the scholarly journals and looking at ways that people presented folklore in the late 1800s, when it really the discipline really emerged, in the early 20s, the 1950s, and then presently. And I mean, especially from an anthropological perspective, I mean, folklore is riddled with the patriarchy and patrician perspectives on the folk, right? These kind of and it was also kind of, to go back to the experiences of Central and Eastern Europe, it was a tool of nationalism, during a lot of the kind of nationalistic projects that led to World War I, that led to World War II. And I want to let somebody else talk about it. Somebody asked about in STEM disciplines. I'm just going to sort of. Go ahead, Leslie.
We've got a lot of conversation in the chat. There's great examples about STEM, examples of promoting equity in STEM classes. So there's at least 6 or 7 already that have come up since the conversation.
So looking at textbooks, I know other people have talked about that in STEM disciplines. I know, there's the pseudosciences of things like, eugenics and the idea in anthropology, that racial difference could be anthropologically explained by science. That's another opportunity to kind of recognize how that has encroached on all of our disciplines.
There's also some links in the chat. There's some links in the chat for some activities for STEM projects. So if anyone's looking at that.
I was just going to show this book here. I don't know if y'all can see it. It's a book that I like. I don't know if it's saying it, if it's going backwards. It's called Teaching Across Cultural Strengths by Alicia Fidelina Chavez and Susan Diana Longerbeam. It's in our references section, but it has a lot of really fabulous examples from, for example, chemistry and geology, biology. I think somebody mentioned that a biology professor has, incorporates stories of famous scientists. Yeah, I mean, the really amazing ways that you can also recognize, promote storytelling. The one example in here from a chemistry class was the first day of class, the chemistry instructor has their students bring in a household item or something from their home to examine the chemical makeup of it. And that's an invitation for storytelling, right? For students to talk about, why did they choose the item? What, why is it important? Maybe you can even go further and ask students to talk about, something that's meaningful to them or something like that. Let's see. Yeah, medical programs. Really powerful ways. Let's see. So Douglas Koch wrote, in our medical program, I'm looking at assessment questions to make sure images represent. So representation, of course, diverse skin colors, injuries, differently abled people, kids that aren't always accompanied by a parent, right, or mother. Absolutely. Yeah, there's other, I wish that I had more time, but I would love to hear, and feel free to share your microphone too and tell a story. It doesn't just have to be in the chat. If somebody has an interesting approach, or also if you feel particularly challenged in your discipline. I'm thinking also of engineering, how, engineering is problem solving, computer science and gaming is storytelling, right? So any, ways that you could incorporate gaming in any discipline is an opportunity to invite levels of storytelling that could be really instructive and equitable. Oh, thank you, Kevin.
Yeah. I see Tara put in the chat that the original textbook had 0 examples of non-white males doing chemistry. So she switch books and use OER resources. That's a great idea. I mean, using outside resources is always a good idea, because if your textbook you're using doesn't have what you need, there's tons of resources out there.
And I think also when you create your own resources, or when you have a photo shoot on campus, to look at the images very carefully and see if there's a diverse range of students and faculty represented, because that is not necessarily always at the forefront of the photographers. And so we can do our own part to do that. Or like you've also shown very well in your presentation, the images you use, they did include very different people.
It's definitely a process, right? I mean, I do feel like, and I think that's one reason that Leslie and I were interested in exploring this topic, because, we've been really entrenched in it for a long time. And it's sort of a part of our disciplinary practice and our own research and our own, backgrounds, but we realize that it's not for everyone, right? And it's having to sort of, and I think, and actually maybe I'll go ahead, since you all are seeing some of these questions here, and I'm sure there's more that we can encounter in the chat there, but it's just kind of as a conclusion, we have just different, like a sort of strategies, ways that even in, if you're teaching a chemistry class or you're teaching a engineering class, really invite different perspectives, invite however you can design exercises that, are going to sort of demonstrate that, maybe even as an overview of the history of your discipline and how it has not been very diverse, but how it can be, and I really, the ways that, I mean, I didn't go into more detail about some of the ways that cultural worldview, the way that we're speaking English in the United States, which is a culture that was dominated by Western Europe, right? So, we were part of the colonization project, of course. And so we don't really spend a lot of time recognizing how very specifically Northern European thinking, linear thinking, the idea that, the idea of progress, the very, very European ways of thinking are not the ways that many of our students still are being brought up to think. If you come from a community that is indigenous, if you come from a community that, from another culture outside of the United States or within the United States, especially African-American culture and indigenous cultures, who obviously have been part of this country for centuries, but it's still, cultural ways of thinking do not align. Time is not considered the same way. The idea that time is fixed and we start at the beginning and that we're on a path and we're going to end somewhere. That's not the way that just basic cultural practice looks at time for a good many number of people in our country, right? And therefore among our students. So those are other ways to kind of be reflective, reflect on how you present your information and how you develop new ideas. So I'm not looking at much of the chat here to sort of get a sense. And please do feel free to use your microphone if you have ideas to share. Definitely want to hear from you. Lots and lots of sites. I'm afraid to click on them because I think they'll change our screen. So.
It is so many great ideas in the chat, so many good links. I'm really inspired by seeing so much good work that's already going on out there. we talk about it here, and I see there's always seems to be a little bit of pushback from work in equity, but to see people out there really doing the work is very, very inspiring. So I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased with it.
In the little bit of time we have left, it might be a good opportunity to explore the idea of challenges and also, backlash. Has anybody encountered any real challenges because of trying to include more diverse voices in your course content? Or specific assignments that you've developed that you found to be effective? Oh, the Padlet. Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
Oops, here's the Padlet's now showing up.
Oh yeah, definitely in literature courses, I could see that. I could see backlash. Yeah, I could definitely see that as well.
Yeah, I want to jump in just quickly. I have to say, I have seen this session has by far the most active chat of the sessions I've been in. And we can capture some of those, but I kind of want to just nudge each of you to click that link to the Padlet and just throw up. You just hit the plus at the bottom and just throw up one idea there. And then Leslie and Sarah, we could actually capture this for you. And it could almost be something that a feedback loop of all the ideas that came from your presentation. So
yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, I realized, that you can probably save that for along with the recording. That'd be wonderful to have that.
Yes, the Padlet is definitely a saved place. The chat's a little harder, but I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I might sit here for a while and try to cut and paste some of the things out of the chat. But
you can save it, I think.
Yeah, no, you can.
So we'll save this. I'm going back to read the teaching English to speakers of other languages. Yes.
I have a question before we end. Has anyone had anyone refuse an assignment? Has anybody had that refuse? I've had that before. Someone refused to do an assignment. I've heard about that here actually on campus. Has anyone had that happen?
I've been assigning a very it's a Katie Couric produced little short segment on a documentary that was on, I can't remember what network she's affiliated with, but 2020 or something like that, about gender, just exploring issues of gender. And I've had several students just tell me that they needed a different assignment, that they couldn't do that assignment. And it's a very inquisitive, really full of stories, right, about people's actual experiences. And I mean, I've had students that felt that they couldn't even, they were really uncomfortable with even listening to the questions. It's challenging. Yeah, Amy's not refusing, but just kind of neglecting, right, to really engage.
Yeah.
Very cool to hear that some people are very eager to share. I was gonna share something about time, because I really liked the Emma talked about time. So there's a really wonderful sort of anecdote from a folklorist named Barry Tolkien, who really honed in on ideas of cultural worldview. He ended up working with the Navajo. He was from the East Coast of the United States and found his way as a college student in the 1950s, I think, or 1940s, out in New Mexico or Utah. He passed out because he had a fever. He got really sick, and he woke up in a hogan, in a Navajo round hogan, surrounded by people who speaking a language he didn't understand, and being fed medicine that he wasn't familiar with, and they nursed him back to health, and he ended up completely redirecting his life and becoming a folklorist and working with Navajo and other Western United States indigenous cultures. And around the 1960s, when the school systems were making it mandatory, because I guess before that, kids who had grown up on reservations weren't required to come to public school, but they felt like, we need to require students to come to public school because they'll have more access to opportunities and economics mobility. And the students had to show up at class when the bell rang, and they walked into rooms with desks with the lines, the teacher in the front and the lines of desks in square rooms. And they really felt physically uncomfortable. They could not relate. They couldn't even come to after school projects to help them do better. They arranged special after school tutoring sessions, and the students didn't even want to come to that because it was like you had to show up at 3, right? And so they invited members of the tribe and people that were familiar with the systems, and they were like, well, first of all, you have to make the chairs in a circle. Like, the students are just not going to feel comfortable in these square desks, and you can't say that it has to start on time, because in our culture, the meetings start when everybody gets there and they're over when the business is over. This Eurocentric idea that you can get business done in an hour, right? Or you can get classwork done in an hour is just completely foreign to some cultures. Business might take 5 minutes or it might take 5 days. It just depends, right? And imposing those kinds of rules on students who felt physically uncomfortable with that idea, or writing an essay about what you did on your summer vacation or what your future plans are, were just completely foreign to them. Yeah.
We need to wrap up.
Okay, sorry. I know I wasn't looking at the time.
That's okay. In the chat, I'm like, but this is so sad because this is such a great dialogue and learning. And as Kevin pointed out, this can continue in the Padlet. In other words, the Padlet has become, as you can see, an amazing little resource of all of the great ideas and best thinking and some other resources that came from this group. So I was wondering, Sara, if you'd be willing to resend your screen share so folks can see each other as we wrap up and shift.
Absolutely.
There, yeah. So I want to say, first of all, thank you, Leslie and Sara, as that was a huge amount of information jammed into a 45-minute session. And you can tell by the chat and the comments and the Padlet a very, very needed structure and conversation and resources. And thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks everyone for being there.
Yes. And another for sociologists, Leslie. And so yes, thank you. A couple of reminder to participants. We continue in this Zoom room at 2 o'clock. The next session will start. And again, a reminder that the recordings, I'm going to stop the recording momentarily, and the recordings for each session will be available on the webpage for the conference as soon as we can get them up there. So stay with us or come back at 2 o'clock. And again, Sara and Leslie, that was really spectacular, and thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
The magnificence of the session means y'all have to come back next year and do another session or 2 sessions divided into a couples, because it's clearly appreciated and needed. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for your comments and contributions.